And we're live, Chair.
Good evening and welcome everyone. I'm Andrew Dacres, Chief Executive of West London Business, but also chair of Ealing Business Partnership. If I can start by
was no timer on it, so when I pressed the,
if I can start by asking folk to put on mute your microphones,
like that. So I clicked into it, so it must have finished.
We're getting quite a lot of feedback at the moment, so if we can mute some contributors, that would be fantastic. Okay, I think the audio situation has calmed down a little bit. So welcome again to this evening's meeting of Ealing Business Partnership. I'm your chair for the evening, and this is a meeting that's taking place both via Zoom, where both councillors and some members of the public that have sort of come into the Zoom space can contribute sort of directly to the discussions, but is also being broadcast live to Ealing Council's YouTube page. Now, I hope that everyone's comfortable and ready to go, and that I can sort of formally call the meeting to order. We have apologies for absence on the agenda, and I note that Cameron Mirza, who for many years has been Vice Chair of the Partnership alongside me, has sent his apologies, but also informed officers that he'll be stepping down from his position on the board. So I'd like to take the opportunity to sort of formally thank and minute our thanks to Cameron for his time on the partnership. I'd also flag that it is very useful having a vice chair, because there are occasions when I can't act as chair due to diary commitments. So if there are local business people that would like to step forward into the vice chair role, do please get in touch with us. Jack, have we had any other apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. I can confirm we haven't had any other apologies.
Okay, thank you. And then moving on to urgent matters, which is our second item. I don't think there are any urgent matters this evening, so we'll move straight through to declarations of interest, and a question for members of the committee as to whether you have any declarations of interest to make. I can't see any hands going up or anyone frantically waving at the camera to get my attention, so I'm assuming, and neither can I see anything in the chat, so I'm going to assume that we don't have any declarations this evening, and move on to the minutes of the previous meeting, which were, just under a year ago, 16th of February 2023, and they're attached to the agenda pack. Can I confirm that people are happy to accept those minutes of the previous meeting, or are there any corrections or matters arising that anyone would like to flag?
Agreed.
Agreed, yeah.
Thank you. So that moves us swiftly into our first substantive item for this evening, which is the 2023-24 budget strategy and medium-term financial strategy of Ealing Council. The full document can be found in the supplementary pack for this agenda, but I think I'm going to turn to Councillor Donnelly, along with officers, to perhaps make an introduction to this item, at which point we'll then move on to questions from the committee and any other attendees. Councillor Donnelly.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair. And can I add my own thanks to Cameron Mirza, who chaired nobly in your absence, I think 12 months ago. So demonstrated very much the value of having a vice chair. I hope you're able to find an equally capable replacement. So this meeting, traditionally, it's not primarily about the politicians. You have the benefit of hearing good technical information from our excellent team of officers. But I just want to put, by way of the beginning of the presentation, and perhaps we can upload the presentation that we have for you, for a little bit of context, and then as it goes through, you'll mostly hear from Emily Hill, who is our Strategic Director, Resources, and then around that, Emily will introduce other members of her team, some of whom you know very well, others who will be new to you. So if we can move on, I think we know that that's why we're here. Tonight's mostly about numbers, but I think it's important to understand that budgets don't arrive without a context. They don't arrive without a context. They don't arrive without a direction of travel. Where have we come from? Where are we trying to get to? And so I thought I'd spend just a couple of minutes filling in, perhaps from a political side, the thinking of the administration that's led to it. Can we move this? I'm still looking at the cover slide. I don't know about other people. That's it. So here's the agenda for the evening. I'll talk a little bit about vision, and then my colleagues will principally lead you through the more detailed side of it. So next slide, please. So why do we set a budget in the first place? Why do councils do anything? These are challenging times for councils. You'll undoubtedly have been seeing in the news, reading in the press about the financial challenges that councils face, and there'll be a bit more about that later. And one of the things that has helped focus our mind on here in our vision of what we're trying to achieve through the budget is that the role of the council in facilitating how the community works, how it works, how people and businesses work with each other is all the more important. People don't want the council just to do everything for them. They want us to assist them in doing things for each other. And that's about helping to build deeper, stronger roots of identity in place. And well, here we go. Here we go. Oh, we're back. So for us, an important part of what we're doing, and particularly relevant, I think, to tonight's discussion, is for us to facilitate, to build opportunities for businesses, for the community as a whole, to do more things better itself with our help. Because we know, and just taking down to that last point, with or without a council, people and businesses are active in their communities. It doesn't need the existence of a council to create that. They want to make lasting, deep commitments to each other, and we have a role as a council in helping to bring that about. So if we can move it on, please. I'll hand now over to Emily, who'll just talk you through the backdrop and messages.
Thanks, Councillor Donnelly. My name's Emily. I'm Emily Hill, Strategic Director of Resources, so the Council's Section 151 officer, so Chief Finance Officer. Okay, so I'm just going to give you sort of the financial context really to this year's budget. It's quite difficult times, really. We've seen core funding from government fall over this last 10 years, quite significantly, even in cash terms. But when you take into account sort of the impact of inflation, we're dealing today with 56% less money, less spending power, essentially, than we had 10 years ago. And that's a reality that we live with. I think that reduction seems significant, but it is even more significant when you think during that time, actually, our population as well has increased by 8.5%. And actually, more significantly, sort of over 20% in people aged 65 and over. And we look, actually, a big part of our spending is on older adults in adult social care. While we have had that reduction in funding, we have seen a shift in the nature of that funding and the way the funding has sort of been allocated previously to general funding, which the authority has been able to choose how it allocates and spends, to social care funding, where the funding now needs to be channeled towards those demand-led services, both in adult social care and children's services. So despite those tricky times, Ealing has balanced its budget, and it's done through making savings to try to manage demand, so older people don't need our help, or children and families don't need our help, and also through increasing council tax. But as we see, after 10 years of significant funding, those savings are getting increasingly difficult to deliver by sort of shaving off efficiency, making small changes, and sort of particularly going forwards, we're going to need to look to wider scale transformation. In working towards the vision that Steve talked about, in actually enabling others to support themselves and to support each other. I think this year has sort of almost reached a tipping point in local government. You see more in the news around financial failure in local government. So you see places like Croydon issuing what's called Section 114 notices, which is essentially almost a bankruptcy notice, and to say we cannot live within our means, and we have to revert to very strict statutory service provision. And one of the things that sort of caused that tipping point is pressures in the social care market, but also increasingly, particularly in London, an increase in homelessness, as people are finding it more and more difficult to find affordable accommodation, and we have sort of more need coming through as a result of government asylum policy, and less places to put people, because government asylum policy is also placing people in the borough, taking up available accommodation that we would otherwise have been using. So despite that sort of difficult picture, we have balanced the budget, and our reserves do provide some resilience to manage these risks. But I would just note that we're comparatively less resilient than other London boroughs who do have higher levels of reserves than Ealing. So something that we need to look out for. I think I was just going to pick up this next slide before Kevin was going to take over. So this is just trying to illustrate really the reductions in funding and how the council funds itself and the change over time. So the red line below talks about the standard funding assessment. So that's the amount of government grant, general government grant, that the government expects to give to the council. So you can see the red line, really quite steep reductions until 1920, and then a slight increase over the last few years. The red line, of course, is the cash level. The blue line is the real terms level, so when we account for inflation. So even though in the last few years we've started to see very small increases in government funding, when you take into account inflation being very high over these last few years, we're actually seeing real terms reductions in funding on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we're seeing what government calls core spending power. So that's the amount of money that government considers to be available to councils. And the difference between the right-hand side and the left-hand side is council tax. So whilst we've seen slight increases in government funding on the left-hand side, the bigger increases in cash funding available to councils' core spending power is because of the expectation that councils will increase council tax to the maximum, what the government would call the referendum limit, before which the council would need to have a local referendum to raise council tax any higher.
And if I can just add to Emily's point on that one, I mean, you may well have seen in Parliament in the last couple of days, a select committee talking about the real crisis of funding in local government. And I think the graph on the left illustrates it very well. It's not a tricksy graph. The y-axis has a zero origin. It's not zoomed in on some larger scale. And so this is the first half of the story, because the second half of the story Emily's already flagged, which is that in key areas, the demands on that blue line, and on the kind of ochre line on the right-hand graph, the demands have been shooting up in a largely unforeseeable and certainly unprecedented ways. So if you want to know where the figure of £4 billion needed to stop local government collapsing in ruin comes from, think of that blue line. Sorry, Emily.
No, that's exactly right. And as Steve said, the ochre line again, so although we've seen big cash increases, the impact of inflation by the time we put real terms cash changes is actually that ochre line in the last few years is relatively flat. We're not seeing the increases which should go alongside the increases in demand. So that's explaining, I guess, the context behind our budget. And Kevin, who will introduce himself, I'm sure, will sort of taking us from last year's budget through to this year's budget, how we start to make that up.
Good evening, committee. My name is Kevin Kilburn. I'm the Director for Strategic Finance. So, as Emily says, I'm going to take you through how we've built the budget up for next year and also for the medium term, the next 4 years. This first slide just shows, in summary, how we built the budget up. So starting, if you like a table, it's on the left-hand side. If you like a graph, it's presented in a graphical format. So I'll start with the graph. So we assessed inflation, both our pay inflation and our contract inflation, and we did that in the early autumn, and we assessed that at £11 million. So that's the first pressure.
Kevin, I'm finding your audio is quite distorted, and I'm just wondering whether you might want to switch your video off just to see whether it's better on audio only.
I'm sure everyone will agree with that. Right, is that better? Can you hear me now?
Thus far it is, so keep going.
Okay, I'll carry on. So I won't repeat everything I said, but the first pressure we assessed was inflation at £11 million. Then we looked at our service pressures right across the piece. I'll come on to this a bit more, but suffice to say that the vast majority of those pressures are in social care and homelessness, nearly £40 million, £38.8 million. So that's all the bad news, or in terms of the pressures on the council's budget. We've got a small amount from our fees and charges. Again, I will say more about that later. A technical review, I'll just say a few words about that now. That's looking at our treasury management functions and the levies that we have to pay, particularly for concessionary fares. That was still a net decrease in cost. Following the provisional local government finance settlement towards the end of December, although we're waiting for that to be confirmed, hopefully next week, we're getting additional funding from the government and from business rates of just under £24 million. That then led to us to find savings. So the gap from there, which is about £24 million, the gap from there that we need to find, we can do it in two ways. One is through savings, which is efficiencies and reductions in service, but also the change in how we deliver services, and then from the council tax increase. They're the two levers really that the council has at its disposal to balance the budget, which it has done for 24-25. So I'll start off with inflation. Like all businesses, households, like all of us, we faced quite significant inflation over the last 12 to 18 months. Even though that's now falling, many of our contracts have clauses in them that fix the increase the following year to a particular month's inflation. It's quite often around September in many, but not always. So in September last year, inflation was 6.7%. So even though today the Bank of England is hinting that in the next few months it may come down to 2%, we are locked into contracts now for the next year at a much higher rate. And as I said before, in total, inflation, both pay and contract inflation, is £11 million. The next and really large area that we face is the pressure on our services. Much of this is demand-led, particularly in the first two lines there, which is adult social care and also in children's services, both in children's social care and SEND and special needs, special educational needs and disabilities. Over £32 million pressure that we're facing there. And that pressure is not a gross pressure. It's been mitigated by actions that they can take quite easily, or by any additional income that an increase in demand, particularly in adult social care, will come with it. So that's not a gross figure. It has been mitigated. Sorry, so I'm going to speak there. The pressure from social care we've been experiencing for a number of years. All local authorities have been experiencing that for a number of years. What has changed in the last year, perhaps just over last year, as Emily was saying before, is the increase in homelessness. And you can see that in the line under housing and environment. The vast majority of that pressure there is due to temporary accommodation that we're needing to find. And as demand goes up, supply is not really going up to match that. It's just pushing up the cost in both ways. Just very quickly, fees and charges. The council can charge for a whole range of services. If you've had a look at Appendix 3, there's something like, I don't know, is it 40 pages of schedules, if you want to read it all, on all the fees and charges that the council will levy, it is allowed to levy for the services that it provides. And a number of different types of services, some and the regulations around those. Some of them are driven by legislation, and we can only increase or not increase as legislation will allow. Other fees and charges are discretionary, and what we've done there is, first of all, to make sure that we're covering our costs, but then also to apply an inflationary increase. But where fees are set to provide commercial services, then we will set those in line with the market. And not a huge increase, really, once you take in all the statutory services that we can charge for. Less than £500,000. What's that then? It's less than 1%, isn't it, overall? I mentioned before about the local government finance settlement. The government, following the autumn statement each year, the government will set out what councils what they want councils to spend for the following year. When I was much younger, that used to happen in November and followed by a final settlement in December before Christmas. What we've got in the last few years, and this year was no exception, was that it's the provisional settlement. It was on the 18th of December, so only a few working days before Christmas, which is great. And we haven't had the final settlement yet. And in fact, we were expecting to have a briefing tomorrow on the final settlement, but it's been cancelled. So I'm assuming that we're just not going to get it this week at all. So by now it is quite late. But what we've learned from the provisional settlement is that it's nationally what the government call the core spending power. As Emily has explained, that's the total of our business rate, what the government expect us to get through business rates, what they expect us to get through council tax, and then a range of government grants that make up our core spending power. And that was they announced that would increase our funding by £22 million, or 6.5%, which was just slightly above the national average, just slightly above there. However, when you have a look at that, half of it is actually from the local council tax, from the local taxpayer. 11 million will be raised from the council tax. Our grants increased by 11 million in total. And as you'll see from a slide in a few minutes, that started to shift the grants away from general grant funding, where the council has discretion over how it spends that, perhaps on universal services, much more towards was being directed at social care. So that's a real switch in the amount of discretion that the council has in how it spends its money. Excuse me. Although we haven't had the final settlement yet, last week, as you probably know, the government announced a total of £600 million additional funding for local authorities in England. 500 million of that is for social care. While we are, we don't know yet how much Ealing is going to get for that. We've done our calculations and expecting somewhere between £2.5 to £3 million additional funding for that, which is welcome, it has to be said. Not so welcome is yet again for the 6th consecutive year. It's a 1-year settlement. The government for many years have promised multi-year settlements to allow councils to plan on a longer term basis, but that for all sorts of reasons, that hasn't been the case over the last 6 years. Savings. So, as I said before, one of the levers that the council does have to balance the budget, and it must by law balance the budget. Otherwise, as Emily said, she would have to issue a Section 114 notice, but we're nowhere near that at the moment. We have is savings. So we've all the directors have looked at how they can make savings, and a total of just under 16 million for next year, but heavily geared there towards the really big spending services in adult social care and children's social care. In the pack in Appendix 2, there's a schedule for each directorate and what those savings are, should you be interested. And then the second lever we have is on council tax to an extent. As you're probably aware, the government set a referendum limit. There's no cap, which is what used to happen. But if the standard council tax is increased by 3% or more, then the council must hold a referendum on that increase. As the council tax increase has to be expressed to 2 decimal places, that means the maximum you can increase the council tax by is 2.99%. The other part of the council tax over the last, I think, 6 or 7 years has been the social care precept. That is something the government have set an increase of 2%. So add the two together, it's a total increase of 4.99%. In terms of what that means, both for the council and also its residents, and is a range of options that the council could have. A 1% increase in the council tax would lead to an extra £1.7 million. 2%, twice that, and 3% or 2.9, just shy of £5.2 million. What that means for our residents, when you add the social care precept onto that, at the 2.99% for the council tax and the 2% for the social care precept, gives us £8.6 million. What that means for our residents is an increase of about 70p, about £70 a year, and about £101 at 13 pence a week. And then to bring it all together, this is what the budget, the net budget, looks like for our services, shown by directorate. And also we've forecast this out for the following 3 years. So looking at 24-25, you can see that the budget is balanced. So our net budget requirement there is met exactly by our total funding. And I'll say a little bit more about that on the next slide. Then looking out though, so pressures, we've assessed inflation, possible savings. What we can't do though is decide what council tax is going to be, nor government grants, because government grants are clearly outside of our control. The government may turn around and say, no, you're not having any more. And the council tax is a decision for the council to make each year. So if we didn't get that extra funding or any extra funding, or we didn't make any extra savings, you would see that our cumulative deficit would rise from 25-26 from 28 million pounds to nearly 82 million pounds in 4 years' time. And finally, for me, I'll just say a little bit more about how the council funds that net revenue budget from 4 main sources. One is the retained business rates, which I'm sure you're interested in. Secondly, the council tax, the collection fund, whether there's a surplus or deficit on that. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And the revenue support grant, likewise. So the vast majority of our funding, 2 pie charts here, one showing what it was for last year for 23-24, the other one showing what it will be for 24-25. Council tax bringing in the vast majority of that, just under 60%, 182 million pounds. Obviously, that's all paid by the council taxpayers on their homes in the borough. Secondly, is the retained business rates. Just some background to the business rates. When businesses pay their business rates to the council then retains just 30% of that. The remainder has to be paid over to, first of all, to the Greater London Authority, but also back to central government. And what central government do with their portion of that right across the country, they pull that and redistribute that to all authorities. And part of that comes back in the revenue support grant, but also in other grants like New Homes Bonus Grant, etc. So, and there's a distribution mechanism to that with the idea that it is supposed to be fair across the country, that all councils can provide the same level of service because of their funding. But that system has been in place now for over 10 years and it's starting to creak. And the government keeps saying they are looking at it, but again, other things get in the way. Just very quickly on the collection fund. So the figures there for both council tax and retained business rates are forecasts. We can't say exactly what it's going to be because some people won't be able to pay, can't pay. At the same time, there may be an increase in the council tax base or the amount of business rates collected because there's more businesses. So that's just an estimate. So that goes into a collection fund when it's collected, and at the end of the year there will be a surplus or deficit on that, and then that goes in to the following year's budget. So for 23-24, we think we've got a surplus on that of £3.4 million. So that in that case, it helps. Last year, not shown very well on a pie chart, we actually had a deficit of £3 million, and that tends to be the way it goes in that cyclical basis. Okay, that's it from me. I'm going to pass back to Emily.
Thanks, Kevin. So we've just got a couple of slides, I think, just to, I guess, set the end of the context and the risks to the budget. So this slide shows our reserves forecast. So our reserves are, well, as any business have, are the reserves that we have. So it's usually, well, it is backed essentially by cash. We hold reserves to manage uneven cash flows, to manage timing differences, to enable us to respond to events, unexpected events as well. So not here, but in my previous authority, when we had COVID, the council needed to know that it had sufficient reserves in order to take the sort of necessary actions that it needed to do in what was an emergency, and without clear indications at the time that government would fully fund that expenditure. So its reserves enabled it to do that, knowing that hopefully government grant funding would come, but if it didn't, it had reserves to do that. And also we need to build up funds to meet known or predicted requirements. And the total value of our reserves looks quite comfortable when you look at it just as a total figure of 130 million sort of expected to have at year end. But actually, when you look at that, that's not all the council's money to spend freely. So 17 million of that belongs to schools. Just under 10 million of that belong to our social housing tenants, our tenants of our HRA. 8.6 million of that must only be spent on highways and other eligible spending for the parking account, and others are other ring-fence grants, public health, DSGs, is dedicated schools grants. So there are ring-fenced funds, and then there are also other funds such as the insurance fund, where we self-insure, and probably most specifically out of all those committed ones, PFI reserves. We have a number of private finance schools where we have future liabilities to make payments in relation to those schools, and so that reserve holds those funds to enable us to make those payments over the next number of years and meet those liabilities. So when we take all of those out, we get left with two amounts. One which is the general balance, which is sort of your very rainy, stormy day fund, the thing that will allow you to continue to provide vital services in the event of significant uncertainty or unexpected events. That's your general balance, the purple there, which then leaves you, or leaves me, or the council with 20 million of discretionary reserves to enable us to deal with what is quite significant uncertainty in relation to demand for our services, inflation, and other sort of economic factors. Which brings us on to why we need to hold these reserves, which is to manage the risks in the budget, which is in the next slide. Thanks, Kev. And so like businesses like you, I think we face a number of very similar risks. Certainly businesses have risks in relation to inflation and interest rates, and need to be able to manage the volatility and increases in those. Possibly less so, we have to provide services to people whether they can pay for them or not. So a lot of our services are demand-led, where we cannot choose whether or not to support people and provide services. So we have demand-led pressures with adult social care, with children's, now with homelessness. Whereas that demand comes in, we must respond to it. Like you, I'm sure you have efficiency savings and other sort of cost reduction plans, and we need to ensure that we can deliver those. And there are risks in significant partnerships and contracts. So like you, again, I'm sure there are supply chain risks that you have and costs that you've seen rise in relation to your contracts. As well as the revenue aspect, we have significant capital developments, particularly in relation to affordable housing, but also other things like the current Gurnell scheme that's being drawn up. And we've seen sort of the risks around capital developments and the capital sort of expenditure and markets there at the moment. We've talked about reserves and the ability for those, but we've also got uncertainty regarding the future of our funding, which Kev's already set out. And something I suspect we do both have similar issues as well is the ability to collect income. So to collect council tax, to collect business rates, to collect the income from our fees and charges, particularly difficult in a cost of living crisis. So whilst we always, and as everybody does, is you make the best estimate you can at a point in time in the budget, there are a number of risks that we will need to manage throughout this year to deliver that budget, and hence the need for reserves to help us to manage them. So I think that's the main run through of the budgets. Councillor Donnelly, I'm not sure if you wanted to make any further closing comments.
I just wanted, thank you, Emily, that was very clear. I just wanted to say something about the reserves position here, which is that we took a decision 2 budgets ago to begin a process of replenishing our reserves insofar as we had the resources to do so, because it was clear a decade of austerity and seeking to use reserves to balance things had left us relatively poorly positioned compared with some of the London boroughs. So this budget represents the third in a row in which we will propose to put £3.5 million into reserves. And one of the reasons for that, if you think back to the 4-year projection that Kev put up, if you see some of those enormous figures of projected deficit, we're trying to build up some kind of fund for a rainy day with these big waves coming towards us. Now, history shows, looking back the last few years, that most of those numbers probably won't end up as bad as that. The downside is we've no idea how or when or to what extent they won't be as bad as that, because we are living year to year and almost hand to mouth. And I think there's been a lot of very worn expressions within local government community in the last few weeks when the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities has been talking about encouraging councils to make use of reserves. And that's caused us to raise an eyebrow for two reasons. One, many councils depleted their reserves in the last decade at the behest of the government. And secondly, we can all see these pressures exist now and are only getting worse. So we can't work out how we can possibly responsibly just spend what we have now when we know that worse is coming around the corner. And you can only spend reserves once is the brutal truth of it. So that's kind of the context to why we are again proposing a £3.5 million investment in the reserves, which in the context of the overall council budget, it's not enormous, but every little helps.
Well, goodness, thank you all three of you for that sort of tour de force. A very clear presentation, I thought, on the sort of budget outlook and the sort of challenges that you are navigating. I mean, so having chaired this meeting probably for 6 or 7 years now, they are very familiar themes, and I look forward to a year where you bring slightly cheerier news to this gathering. But I don't think that's going to come anytime soon, unfortunately. I mean, it struck me that one of the things we may want to consider in terms of sort of views that we pass on from the EBP to the cabinet meeting in a few days' time is potentially for the business community to sort of express shared concerns around this continued single-year approach to settlements. The settlements seem to be so late because clearly that does not help with long-term strategic planning. And I was very struck, I think just before Christmas, that for the first time London councils was sufficiently concerned about the fragility of local government finances that they convened a meeting of West London Business, the CBI, what was London First, now Business London, and FSB in London, to seek our broad support for more investment and long-term thinking when it comes to local government finances. And I think the consensus of those around the table was that for business to succeed, we need local government to be robust and to be able to deliver good local services, because that's what our staff, employees, and our businesses rely upon. So that's perhaps for us to consider shortly. But in the meantime, any questions? I always have questions, but any questions from those both councillors around the table, reflections? I know some of our local councillors have run businesses recently or are in the thick of running businesses themselves, but equally may have some guests that have sort of come in around the EBP table tonight. So do just if you want to either put up a virtual hand, wave at the camera. I'll go into gallery mode so I can see anyone waving that wants to come in, or indeed use the chat facility to to drop any questions that you might have in there. Whilst folk mull over that opportunity to interrogate your presentation further, I'll just sort of come back with one or two questions that struck me and may have struck those that are tuned in on YouTube and therefore can't come back to you with some questions. If my understanding was correct, there was potentially a 15 million increase in corporate spend, possibly forecast for next financial year, so not the one after the one that we're sort of honing in on. Any indications that you can sort of share as to why that growth in corporate spend is forecast?
Yeah, I'll say that is due to, so we are in the position at the moment where much of the budget is being supported through our treasury management functions, through the interest we earn on cash balances, but we expect over time, over the next few years, to spend those cash balances on capital projects, and also for interest rates to decrease. So that is reflecting that increase in net expenditure in the corporate services.
Yeah.
So I think that's the change in the corporate budget line. The 15 million growth in the future for the 25, 26, 27, 28 is actually just currently an estimate of what we think additional demand-led services will do. It's an estimate of growth. So we believe and expect that until we can put in place further demand-led sort of demand management things and manage the market, as we have in the past 3 years, we've had to put growth into social care services, homelessness. At the moment, we don't know where that would lie. So it's an estimate of what we think demand-led service growth will be required, but we don't know at this point, of course, whether it will be in adult social care, whether it will be in children's, whether it will be in homelessness. What we do know is this year we put a gross 38 million into services. I think in the previous year it was 40 something million. So 15 is potentially hopeful, only that we can't see that continued, exponential growth really in those services continue. They have to stop. We know inflation is starting to calm down, so we don't expect to see that significant growth at the moment, though. It's in as a corporate line, but by the time it gets to the budget, we expect that to be allocated into the services, most likely adult social care, children's, and homelessness. But at the moment, it's a planning assumption.
Okay, thank you. And I suppose a sort of related sort of follow-up of sorts, and then if we don't have any questions coming in, we'll move on to the next substantive item, is that you've kind of talked about, I suppose, in some sense, the two options you've got of kind of continued top slicing of different areas to kind of push through savings versus more transformative change. I'm sure local residents, local businesses will have seen examples of top slicing and certain facilities, etc., just having to close over the years because there's no longer the funds to support them. But I wonder whether you or one of the councillors can give us an example of some transformative change where actually the council's been just able to adopt a fundamentally different way of delivering a service that has been in the process more cost effective.
I'm happy to give an example, Councillor Donnelly, unless you wanted to start. So one of the examples in the budget is, and something that we're sort of looking into more, is to use going back to our vision in terms of connection with the community, is to use direct payments. So direct payments have been around for some time within social care, but rather than you would hear a much more convincing argument, I'm afraid, from our Director of Adult Social Care than me, but I will try my best. Is that after an assessment, often we will give in social care, we would give a very prescriptive response to that assessed need. We might suggest, a home care visit 3 times a week by an external home care, 3 times a day perhaps, by an external home care company that we would then pay for. One of the proposals within the report is to provide that individual needing care with more freedom and choice over that care, where we provide them with a direct payment, whereby they could then identify their own support that they need, potentially use more local businesses, more micro enterprises, more local community solutions. For example, again, sometimes people might be going to a day centre for a hot meal. Actually, through a direct payment, they may be able to attend a local cafe of their choice to eat with residents and neighbours, close residents and neighbours, and be able to use their direct payment for that. So that's a sort of shift in the way we provide services that meets our vision, that's more transformative and meets the vision than that kind of, let's just make that, let's just shave half an hour off that visit. Let's see if we can reduce the cost of that contract, if you see what I mean. So that's one of the examples that's within this year's budget, a real flip towards direct payments and using other potential options for people's care that better meet their needs, better meet their sort of cultural requirements and sensitivities, and hopefully better keep money in the local economy.
Thank you. That's very helpful and brings alive the concept of a more sort of transformative approach. Well, I can't see any more sort of hands up. So any hands up. So we'll keep moving. Thank you again to all contributors, and I think we're going to note the content of this report sort of formally, its appendices, presentation, and that this will be published as part of the Cabinet agenda, and also published on the same day as a supplementary agenda. We also note, I think, any note sort of views expressed. Like my suggestion is that this group conveys a message through the council and London Council's partners to central government around concerns on the continued late notice on sort of final settlement, and also the need to move to multi-year settlements moving forward. So my question, I think, now to members is whether there's anything else you would like to add, or whether those recommendations are agreed.
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 Okay. Thank you. I'm seeing nods and agreement all round. So thank you very much. Without further ado, we will then move on to our second item, which is the business rates update. Close, of course, to the heart of lots of local businesses who are making those contributions. But as has been explained already, we see quite a lot of redistribution outside London. I suppose our long-standing contribution to levelling up the wider country. So to explain more, we're going to turn, I think, to Nick to introduce the item, and then we can take any questions.
Good evening. Thank you, Andrew. So yeah, this is the usual presentation. I think we've done it for a few years now, where we have a quick run through the business rates and particularly focus on the business rate changes that are coming in legislation this year. I do have Paul Tyrrell with me, who is the manager of the business rates team and our business rates expert in the borough. So if we have any highly technical questions, then Paul will be able to pick those up as well. So I think I've probably shown part of this slide before, just giving an idea. We've got currently, as of last week on the valuation office list, we've got 10,831 businesses who are paying business rates in Ealing. And that's out of 17,000 total businesses operating, the difference being those businesses who don't trade out of business premises. Total rateable value, as you can see, at £439 million now. And our net collectible debit for the year for Ealing Council to collect is just shy of 159 million. We are a large borough, 13th largest, as it says, in terms of collectible rates in London, and that's 20th in the whole of the country. So we're a notable player, and I think that's reflected not just in our role within London councils, London Revenues Group, but we also get a table on a lot of the national working groups through central government as well, which allows us to give that Ealing input into national issues as well, which I think is important. And throughout all of our operating through tonight's presentation, we do have to realise the ongoing impacts due to the cost of living and the fact that many businesses in our borough are struggling to operate and are still seeing numerous effects, both from the knock-on from the COVID days, but now with the cost of living crisis and the ongoing impacts of that. So in terms of the figures, these are the impacts for next year. The standard multiplier will be going up. So the government have announced that there will be an inflationary increase of 6.6% to the standard multiplier, and that goes up to 54.6p in the pound from 51.2, which had been held for 2 years. They have, however, capped the small business multiplier, and that's businesses below 51,000 rateable value at 49.9. And there was an actual change in legislation to allow that to happen. Previously, the two multipliers had to go up by the same amount, and they've changed legislation for this year. Crossrail for those businesses who are over 70,000 remains at 2p in the pound, but that the level for Crossrail has extended from 70,000 to 75,000. A lot of new measures were announced in the autumn statement. We've planned, they're included, ready for next year's annual billion exercise. We do, however, wait for the spring statement, which is coming out at the beginning of March, for any other announcements that may be made. And obviously we'll communicate those in due course. So as I say, government announced the multiplier. The good news, I think, is they have continued with the retail relief scheme, which has now been in place for 6 years. We've had a varying range of percentages, as I'm sure many of you will remember. We'd gone from 33 to 50 up to 100 and back to 66 within the COVID year. And now we've been at 75% for 2 years. I think it's a concern of us as a local authority, and I know from many of our business community, if that ever was to be removed and the impacts that would have. So certainly a lot of our lobbying is around the concerns for the business community, as well as ourselves from a local authority perspective. For the qualifying retail properties, there is a cash cap of 110,000 per annum. And that's subject to the usual state subsidy rules. The maximum payable is 315,000 over 3 years. So technically, if a business had received 110,000 over the previous 2 years, it could be capped this year. We're still looking at that, and if anything, it will be 1 or 2 cases in the borough, but it could have a small impact on the payments paid for the 3rd year, which this would be. Okay. And as we say, there's an impact on cases who have received the small business rate relief since 2017. We touched on the valuation last year. Just to say, the valuation was the revaluation was successfully implemented. Bills were out on time, and we hope that we communicated well with the businesses. We've had some good feedback from the business community on the communications that went out, both from ourselves and for once probably from the Valuation Office Agency as well, who actually put out some very clear and detailed communications. So again, a quick reminder how it turned out in the end. We had the 2nd largest increase in London of rateable value. They referred to the Thames Valley corridor and the impacts that we fitted in. I think Crossrail had a certain bearing on that, or the Elizabeth line as we should call it now. But again, that was something we reported last year, but we haven't seen any subsequent changes since. So in terms of the businesses for transitional relief, there has been some, anyone who gained on their bill last year for the first time under a transitional relief scheme, they got the full gain. So in other words, if their business rate bill went down significantly in previous years, the gain they would have had would have been capped. Last year, if their business bill went down, they kept all of the cap. But as you can see, for small businesses, their increases last year were capped at 5%, medium 15%, large 30%. This year, again, there will be a slight change in those caps. So for the small businesses, the increase now can go up to 10%, 25% and 40% for the large businesses. It has got quite a significant impact for those businesses who receive transitional. Last year, we paid out £17.5 million in transitional relief. This year, that will be down to 5 million. So that will be a further 12.5 million, which will be payable by local businesses who were in receipt of transition relief last year. And again, that will all be confirmed on the annual bills which come out. As you'll be aware, the government are now going to 3 yearly revaluations. The next revaluation is the 1st of April 2026, and already the revaluation process is due to commence. So that will kick off using the market rents as at the 1st of April this year, and the Valuation Office will then commence revaluation. I think a lot of businesses were quite vocal, and quite rightly so, complained that last year's or this current revaluation was done just as we were entering the COVID period. I think, unfortunately, we're still in a time of turmoil for many businesses, but hopefully there's a bit more stability than there was back then. But as I say, the revals will then happen every 3 years. Okay. So for Ealing business rates, the business rate bills will be processed and issued on or before the 8th of March. We actually run our billing process on the last week of February. Most accounts now are paying over 12 monthly instalments. And again, a reminder for anyone who is still got their business rate bills on 10 monthly instalments, please contact us. We can move to 12 months. And for those people who are residents of Ealing, a reminder as well, your council tax bills will also default automatically to 10 monthly instalments, which is the statutory scheme. But if you do want to pay your council tax over 12 months, the same rules apply, and that can happen. Okay, so please do contact us and we can move there. Just to give an indication of how much money we have to collect each year, as you can see, in 2019, we were actually collecting £163 million a year. And that was prior to COVID, when there was a large amount of reliefs that were given for businesses, and a lot of businesses almost had virtual payment freezes. Since then, it's gradually eased back up again. To last year, we went back up to 159 million. And for 24-25, I don't know if Paul's run the test data yet, but we're likely to go back over the 163 million in the amount that's payable. And as you can see, the gross rateable value continues to increase. We had the big jump last year with the revaluation, which always tends to happen, but the multiplier is brought down alongside that jump in valuation. So the overall bill should not increase significantly. Business rates retention, I think people should be fairly well aware of this now. Prior to 2018, effectively, we retained all of the money within London. We shared it between ourselves and GLA on a 64-36 split. In 2019, it then was shared with central government, with still us retaining 48%. Now the split after pooling ended, we just retained 30% of it. So although we are issued the bills in the name of Ealing, we only retain 30%, with 37% of the money going to GLA and 33% going to central government, which is, again, slightly different to council tax, where all the money is retained within London, with approximately an 80% split for us and 20% for GLA. There is the London Living Wage Scheme, which I think we've promoted on a number of occasions. Again, if you are a London Living Wage employer, we will give a discount for twice the cost of Living Wage Foundation accreditation. That scheme is due to be extended for a further year. And again, we're looking to review the scheme going into next year as well. Contact details for myself and Paul. If you have any questions, queries at all, please do contact us. We'll be more than happy to assist. And Andrew, a quick run through there, but more than happy to answer any questions But back to you.
Well, once again, thank you for a clear and concise presentation. I'm going to keep my eye on the participants list in case anyone wants to put up their hands or wave at the camera to attract my attention and to come in with any questions. I have one or two for you whilst folk sort of perhaps reflect on that. I'm of course also conscious that councillors that are with us today do have lots of other meetings where you're able to ask questions around these presentations. So anyone that's tuning in and wondering why councillor colleagues are fairly silent, they are in other places asking lots of good, tough questions. But I suppose from a business community perspective, it would be good to perhaps get a sense with the London Living Wage initiative as to how many businesses over the past few years you found have taken up that offer. Well, you're on mute at the moment.
Always the old trick. I think at the moment we're still fairly limited. It's probably only about 20, 25 businesses that we've paid out over the duration of the scheme. But every year we do
a couple of dozen, Nick.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So about 24, 25. Every year we do promote it, and we will be continuing to promote that through this year's annual billing exercise as well. So, as I say, I think we are looking to potentially revise the scheme, but at the moment, the previous scheme is still open.
I know there's a sort of living wage places sort of group that the council has established, and we're certainly supporting from West London Business. But I do think I think we'd all like to see more businesses taking up that incentive. So revisiting exactly how it's structured may be sensible. Councillor Brett.
Oh, hi. I've turned off my camera because I've got several people on my broadband and it's proving a bit difficult. Yeah, just to say on the living wage thing, yeah, we've got obviously there's the businesses that have been mentioned that have had that kind of rebate, but we've got about 66 businesses that have actually signed up to be living wage employers so far, and we. And just to update everybody, you know, the Living Wage Action Group is kind of in full swing, and it's kind of we've got our next meeting in the next few weeks, and so hopefully we'll kind of get a little bit more of a momentum on kind of how we build on that, and then yeah, I think Nick, it would be good to kind of touch base offline just in regards to how we're promoting it, because there are also we launched I think probably about 6 months ago just some other kind of benefits to becoming a living wage employer, so it'd be good to make sure that we include those in any communications as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
My sort of follow-on question, which is linked, is that we've recently been looking at a sort of business rates discount scheme that's been run in Sutton, where they've been using a sort of discounting mechanism to incentivize businesses when it comes to climate change action. And they've, I suppose, the size of the incentives are substantially larger, and clearly the costs for businesses potentially are, you know, are larger when it comes to sort of some of the capital investments that may be needed to move to net zero. And I just wondered whether, as yet, the council's looked at any other sort of discounting mechanisms to incentivise responsible business behaviour, or whether that is something that could be explored in the year ahead.
Paul, there was a couple of other central government schemes, wasn't there, coming in? I don't know if you want to cover off on those at all. About the...
Yeah, there is. There is the green machinery and equipment scheme at the moment. So let me give an example. You've got those the recharging points now in the road. There's no rateable value on them because they're deliberately kept out of rateable value. So there's that incentive. And if you've got businesses with solar panels on their roofs, then you can get a reduction in the rateable value. There's also the improvement relief scheme coming in this year as well. So if you improve your property, you get a relief on that. So it's all connected. Most of that, though, is not a direct thing the council would do. It's the rateable value reduction, either remove a rating or it's reduced. So it's down to the valuation office agency. So they will tell us, yes, okay, reducing the rateable value is what you've got to build based on that.
Andrew, yeah, I was just going to reiterate what Paul said. I mean, they are national initiatives, but I will speak to colleagues at Sutton and get some more details because it does sound quite interesting. And I'll then present that to members, later in the year anyway.
Thank you. And those national initiatives sound interesting. I mean, I think there are so many initiatives and complexities to our tax system that I think small and micro businesses struggle to keep abreast of them. So where they can be communicated or signposted to through council channels, I'm sure that would be welcomed. Now, I can't see any more questions, and for those that started early this morning, the hour is already quite late. And people have families to go and see. So I was going to suggest that potentially in terms of recommendations we might want to pass on to sort of Cabinet in terms of this item, I thought it seemed to make a lot of sense that the retail rate relief scheme should be sustained, or we should be encouraging a national level for that mechanism to be sustained, but also that it should be noted how that loss of transitional relief is being felt very keenly by businesses and needs to be watched closely moving forward as we continue to operate in very fragile times for businesses and local authorities alike, as we heard earlier. So can I put
Sorry, can I?
Oh, go on.
Hi.
Yes, please come in from the
Hi,
iPhone
sorry.
if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, of course. My name is Mehdi Neely. I own a business up in West Ealing. We're electrical contractors, and we have a shop on a high street. And what my question was, what does the panel know about West Ealing bid? Because recently we've been sort of trying to understand where this money goes that we contribute to it every year. There's been serious lack of transparency, no information whatsoever how the money is being allocated or spent. Council takes, I mean, most of the shops where we had a conversation about, they kind of seem to understand that it's part of a business rate, which is not, is actually a completely separate organization. But council collects that fund and forwards that to the separate organization and takes a slight percentage for handling the transaction fees or whatever it is.
Thank you. It's a good question. Just for a bit of context for anyone tuning in on YouTube, business improvement districts, as was described, sort of additional levy on business rates, but following a sort of a vote locally amongst local businesses on a business plan that's sort of put forward, and then a business improvement district company takes on responsibility for using those funds to deliver on the business plan. But I can see Councillor Brett has a hand up. I know Councillor Martin also does a lot of work in our local high streets. So over to you to say a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it would be good if you wanted to touch base on this separately from this call on West Ealing bids. But the council don't really have any authority over the bids. The bids are completely separate. Having said that, we've got very good relationships with several of the bids, and we are trying to build that relationship with the West Ealing bid. There are some that are much more open to council contributions, and there are some that aren't. So it's just kind of a question of building on that a bit. But the council have nothing really to do with the funding. It's all of the businesses in West Ealing that pay into it, whatever their percentage that is agreed. That is they need to hold then that the West Ealing bid to account, and they've actually recently won their bid again. So and again, that's not something that we could heavily influence because it's completely separate to the council. But that's something that I'd be happy to kind of have a chat and also involve officers offline separately to this meeting, just to kind of hear about the kind of maybe a few frustrations it sounds there, and how we can maybe move that forward.
And all I'd add from my West London business experience of liaising with a number of business improvement districts across the geography is that generally what I hear from the folk that are running the bids is that they'd like to have more involvement of local business leaders that are contributing in the running of the bids day to day. So if we can connect you with the right people, they may very much welcome your input and support in making sure that your money and other businesses is spent well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, understand that the council has got no involvement, but the funding goes through the council. And if there's any late collection, we still get the letters from the council that they're going to make a come and collect the money due. So it's understand the money doesn't go into the council coffers, but at the same time, council is handling all the logistics, which creates a massive confusion with a lot of the businesses in the area when we sort of confront them, say, are you aware of this and what are you doing about it? And they're all thinking it's part of the business rate. I've no idea why if the council's got nothing to do with it, why the funding goes through the council to create that confusion. And if there's any money to be recovered, again, council gets involved in that. So it's yes, they're not involved, but they are involved at the same time, which creates this big confusion.
I mean, they act as a collection agency effectively for the business improvement district, and it is, I'd suggest, quite an efficient way of getting the contributions from all of the businesses. But I'll bring Nick in for additional comment.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think you probably know as well as I do on that. Yeah, Andrew's 100% right. We are a collection agency for the Business Improvement District. They could do it themselves. They could go to a third party, but we use the same computer system to collect the bids that we do to administer business rates. So in other words, we can do it far cheaper than they would be able to if they were to collect it themselves. So if anything, it's providing a cheaper service for the bid. I do agree that there can be some confusion. The council tax bills will come out in early March. The bid bills will follow about a month or two later. And we normally do try and keep them separately like that, so people are aware that the council tax bills are issued first, and then the bid should communicate as well with the businesses. But certainly when you get the bid bill, it will have a leaflet with it explaining what the bid does. There's 3 separate bids in Ealing, which is the Ealing Broadway one, the West Ealing and Acton, and every single one will have its separate individual leaflet and a totally separate set of rules and charging mechanism.
Thank you for that input. And I'll try to communicate with the panel regarding this matter, because like I said, there is at the moment there is a I don't know, lack of transparency about how the funds are, where the funds are going at the moment in West Ealing one, which we can't prove anything at the moment, but there is a case that a lot of business are getting together to find out what is going on with the funds at the moment.
No, that's very helpful feedback, and I'm sure everyone on this panel want to make sure that there is absolute transparency and clarity over how the bid monies get invested. I've dropped my my email address into the chat if you want to copy me in on any of that follow-up correspondence, and all the councillors' email addresses are available on the council website. Now, I can't see any more questions, so if I can go back to those recommendations to pass on to Cabinet around retail rates relief needing to be sustained, and also the keenly felt impact, the loss of transitional relief for many businesses, are you happy, members, that we convey that message on to Cabinet?
Agreed.
Yeah, agreed.
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 Fantastic. Well, thank you very much to councillors and officers, and indeed members of the public that joined us within the Zoom space, but also tuned in on YouTube this evening. Very important point in the annual cycle, and some additional scrutiny that we bring to bear on this this process. The date of the next meeting will be early February, so this time next year, but is, of course, as always, subject to a bit of change as the budget process itself can move around a bit, given those uncertainties that we talked about earlier on the information flow from central government. But if I can just wish you all very well, thank you again for your contributions, and wish indeed the council team the very best of luck over the coming weeks and bringing the budget process to a successful conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.